Today's episode is made possible by Northwestern University Press and their new release, Art is Everything, by Whiting Award winner Ixtamaya Murray. In her funny and propulsive new novel, Murray offers us a portrait of a Chicana artist as a woman on the margins. Written as a series of Instagram essays, Snapchat freakouts, and rejected Yelp reviews that merge confession with art criticism, Art is Everything shows us the painful but joyous development of an artist whose world implodes just as she has a breakthrough. Listeners receive a 20% discount on Art is Everything or any other title with promo code POD20. This offer is available at nupress.northwestern.edu. Today's episode is also brought to you by Parek O'Donnell's The House on Vesper Sands, a January indie next pick that Helen MacDonald calls funny, eerie, tender, haunting, and unsettling, smokily atmospheric, and fantastically enjoyable. Set in late Victorian London, the novel tells the story of a rash of missing girls, all of whom seem to have disappeared under similar circumstances. On the case is Inspector Cutter, a detective as sharp and committed to his work as he is wryly hilarious, and his sidekick, Gideon Bliss, a Cambridge dropout in love with one of the girls who's gone missing. As the duo peels back the mystery layer by layer, they offer a glimpse into the strange undertow of late 19th century London and the secrets we all hold inside us. The House on Vesper Sands is out on January 12th from Tin House and available now for pre-order. Well, somehow, if you are listening to this, and I'm saying it, we've made it to 2021. So Happy New Year, everybody. Even if the turn of the calendar year is an arbitrary division of time, the ritualistic and superstitious part of me wants to believe we are turning a page. But on the other hand, I think of Samuel Beckett when asked in 1983 by the Times for his New Year's resolutions and hopes, where he responded with a brief telegram that went, resolutions, 0, stop, period. Hopes, 0, stop, Beckett. And yet, there is something real, not based in the stories we tell ourselves, that is happening this time of year. The return of the light, the retreat of the night, and soon the rising of the sap in the trees. My pink dawn viburnum is starting to bloom. The daphne outside are budding. The hellebore look like they're preparing to show their flowers for Elisa Herod's weekly flower report on Twitter. So even with the pandemic, with the wildfires, with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, with the contested election, and so many other things, the earth is still turning and returning, getting ready to participate once again in renewal. This tension between reality and the real and myth-making, and the ways myth-making is part of the real, is a big part of Vanessa Veselka's latest book. A book that looks at how the absence of narratives or stories can be harmful, and how story and myth-making can be an act of survival, but also looks at the harms caused by myth-making, whether that of a nation and the murder and theft it can gloss over with story, or that of a mother trying to imbue her child with a sense of purpose or destiny or safety. It seems like the perfect writer to begin the year with. One who writes a big American novel that jumps right into the ring with the story America tells itself, while also creating new stories for those who are often never in them. Most guests, when they contribute to the bonus audio archive, read something of their own writing, either something forthcoming or little known, or in a different genre than the main conversation, or they read something by someone else that inspires them. But on rarer occasions, people do something entirely out of the box, like when Chaya Bhuvaneshwar sang, or when several cross-genre hybrid writers, I'm thinking of Alicia Jo Rabins and Dow Strom, when they perform songs with violin and guitar, respectively. Today's guest, Vanessa Veselka, who prior to being a writer was for several decades a working musician both here and in Europe, performs a song for us today as her addition to the bonus archive. That is another thing, like the returning of the light, that has been real and yet feels like a fairy tale, that listeners, in a way that I couldn't have ever dreamed, have lifted up the show and ensured it is going forward into 2021, ready to bloom. And writers, too, have been offering incredible things to entice listeners to become listener supporters. So you can find out how to subscribe to the bonus audio. Check out all the wide variety of possible gifts available for becoming a listener supporter, from broadsides by Forrest Gander to Borges-inspired prints by Ricky Ducournay to limited edition handcrafted collectibles by Nikki Finney, to becoming an early reader for Tin House, receiving advanced copies of 12 books over the course of a year, and a lot more, by heading over to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Enjoy today's program with Vanessa Veselka. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is writer Vanessa Veselka. Veselka's 2011 debut novel, Zazen, for which she first appeared on Between the Covers, was also one of the first publications for Richard Nash's new publication venture at the time, Red Lemonade. Zazen was a book that heralded a new voice, one that prompted Tom Bissell to say, "Vanessa Veselka is something like a literary comet, bright-burning, far-reaching, rarely seen, and a little dangerous." Zazen won the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize, beating out runner-up Leaving the Atocha Station by Ben Lerner. The judges in their citation said, "When practicing Zazen, the disposition of our mind should be to see without being marred by what we see. This definition stands in stark contrast to the experience of reading Vanessa Veselka's keen dystopian novel Zazen. We can't help but be injured and destabilized. We can't help but find the contents at once disturbing and funny, explosive and muted, encyclopedic, intimate, and painfully honest. On top of all of this, Veselka has thrown herself into every single sentence of this lyrical, incisive, nervy book, turning even the most nightmarish scenes and satirical dialogue into effortless beauty. An ambitious encapsulation of our modern times, Zazen tackles counterculture hipsters, geology, Buddhism, consumerism, terrorism, veganism, family drama, and above all, love. In doing so, Zazen brings to the foreground the most fragile aspects of living the 21st century life and how, in the end, we as a society can become the very thing we fear. Unsurprisingly, Zazen is being reissued by Vintage a decade later in the fall of 2021. Vanessa Veselka is a graduate of Reed College, which she attended as a non-traditional student, 15 years older than most of her classmates, waitressing at a vegan cafe, driving nightcab, and raising her daughter as she worked on the manuscript that became her first book. You won't see her schooling in her bio, however, but rather her non-traditional schooling as a teenage runaway, hitchhiker, sex worker, independent record label owner, and union organizer. She was also, from the 1980s into the 2000s, a working musician. She opened for the Ramones and Faith No More in Europe with her band The Remnant, moved to Seattle and formed Bell, which played with everyone from the White Stripes to Sleater-Kinney, and later with Steve Moriarty of the Gits formed the band The Pinkos. It's Vanessa's life out in the world, on the road, one that courted risk and chance and discovery, that informs both her fiction and nonfiction. Her 2012 piece for GQ, The Truck Stop Killer, investigates whether her own brush with death might have been a near escape from the serial killer Robert Ben Rhodes. This and much of her nonfiction explore the gender dynamics of a woman on the road and the effect on women of the absence of quest narratives centered around female protagonists. The Truck Stop Killer went on to be included in Best American Essays 2013, and her other short prose has appeared in The Atlantic, Tin House, Smithsonian, Maximum Rock and Roll, and Bitch Magazine, among other places. Vanessa Veselka returns to Between the Covers to discuss her much-anticipated new novel, The Great Offshore Grounds from Knopf, a book that was longlisted for the National Book Award in Fiction. Publishers Weekly, in its starred review, says, Veselka blends fascinating details of seamanship, cab driving, and boot camp with intimate, spot-on descriptions of contemporary American poverty. This gritty and unsentimental work is compassionate, funny, and deeply human. Lidia Yuknavitch adds, I immediately fell in love with the phenomenal sisters at the heart of Vanessa Veselka's supernova of a new novel, The Great Offshore Grounds. This novel is thrilling in its content, daring in heart, and makes a helix between a novel of ideas and the best damn story of women who forged their identities on their own terms that I've read in years. Roxane Gay adds, The Great Offshore Grounds is a magnificent beast of a novel, utterly engrossing, original, one of the rare novels that understands the realities of American poverty, epic. Finally, Karen Russell says, The Great Offshore Grounds reminded me of what a great novel can do. Veselka's seafaring epic has the forward momentum of a grand adventure and the spiraling depth of a new myth. Darkly hilarious, astral, cerebral, suspenseful, warm-blooded, divine. Welcome back to Between the Covers, Vanessa Veselka.
That's quite, it sounds so much fancier when you say it. But thank you. This is actually, I've been waiting to do this. You have a reputation as everybody's favorite interviewer.
I've been waiting to do this too because it's super gratifying, because you were one of the first 10 or 15 interviews that I ever did. And now, flash forward, here we are. You, right. You a National Book Award finalist for fiction. And as we'll talk about later, our lives sort of intersecting along the way. Which I do want to weave into our conversation at some point. But before we talk about The Great Offshore Grounds specifically, I was hoping we could talk about gender and quest narratives more generally.
Sure. Anywhere you want to go.
So you tackle this head on in your essay, Green Screen, the lack of female road narratives and why it matters. How narratives for women on the road either end in their rape, their death, or both. In that essay, you say, whereas a man on the road might be seen as potentially dangerous, potentially adventurous, or potentially hapless, in all cases, the discourse is one of potential. When a man steps onto the road, his journey begins. When a woman steps onto that same road, hers ends. So I was hoping we could start with you talking more about the scarcity of female road narratives, and then more specifically why it matters that they exist. As I think this question informs, well, both of your books, but this book even more than Zazen.
Yes, absolutely. So when I wrote that, for context, as you mentioned, I had done this piece about a long form piece that appeared in GQ through an old story in my life about a time where I was held hostage in this situation when I was a teenager with somebody that I thought might be this particular serial killer. And in writing all of this, the beginning of any project that you write, or at least the way I view it, is I'm looking for the language that only that project speaks to a degree. I'm looking for like, what is the language of this particular story? And so, I think my work feels a little more cohesive as it continues to sort of develop over the years. But it was very common for me for a long time for people to pick up one thing and say, I can't imagine it's the same writer who wrote this as wrote that, and particularly between my fiction and nonfiction. And some of that was because I really do approach each thing as what is the language that's required for this. And so my first interaction is to find the language. So in searching in writing the original GQ piece, which was a reported investigative piece that had a lot to do with memory as well, I had to find my own way in. How do I tell this story that's very hard to tell, to explain efficiently the difficulty of the kinds of the rules of the world that this is happening in, so that I can explain what I'm about to say. So as I was writing, I was actually going into a lot of investigation of story myself that would be more of what I would think of in fiction, because I was having to try to understand, how do I tell this thing? One of the things that became difficult in the writing of that is, I think I turned it in at 14,000 words, and I think it ended up being 9,700. And what was cut out of it essentially became green screen. And it was because I was trying to do, as we were taking things out, I was getting frustrated because I was of two minds. I was the person trying to tell you a ghost story about death and about women on the road and about all the bad things that happened to them and all the dangers. And I was, at the other hand, the person who had hitchhiked 20,000 miles, who believed in freedom, who believed there was potential, who had a problem with continuing to reify that story of people on the road. At the same time, I had to explain how dangerous it was. So it was causing a problem, right? And I really needed to separate them. So it became a joke as we were writing with my editors, that one's going into the, we called it the, what do we call it? We called it the feminist critique of the article I'm writing. So it was this project where I was doing a current feminist critique of the article I was writing in my own mind. And so I published them within 2 weeks of each other. Wow. And so they are always, in my mind, related in this very particular way, in which that one is kind of almost arguing against the other sometimes.
Yeah.
But I needed a place for that whole other discourse that wasn't academic to me, about why and what does it mean to be on the road that's not just this story. So the story of women being cut off from society, and this is where I think the two stories come together. There's this quality of when you see, and I think I say it in green screen, when you see a woman on the road, it's so much of where the danger is what happens when you see her. What are you seeing? Are you seeing someone, as you say in that quote, that you imagine potential in, for one way? Or are you seeing someone, primarily what most people see is somebody who has the perception, the instinct is somebody who has been shunned, somebody who is cut off, somebody who is invisible to the world, somebody who is dangerous, right? There is not this safe idea that there could be any other reason a woman would, take that step and be on the road. Mm-hmm. And so this quality of shunning is a very big one. There's something like a woman who is that cut off from the pack, from the tribe, from whatever, there's something dangerous about it, and there's something that draws predators about it. That is true. And what green screen is saying is, until we can even start to imagine that there's a quest that these, women could be on, that there's some possibility, then there are so few options that all of the ways that you become visible, because it's about invisibility, and both pieces have that in common. What happens if I decide you've been shunned for something? I decide there's something wrong with you. I decide I don't want to get into that mess. That's not my mess to get into. And then I decide, because the price of what that may mean for you is high, I have to tell myself, I didn't really see it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I think about that, I think about the way it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, or as it seems to, like the way in which the absence of narratives leads people not to see people who are outside of the narratives. So when when you wrote The Truck Stop Killer, you went back to places that were the site of brutal murders outside of diners where a woman was left in a dumpster. And you were talking to people who were working there at the time that these things happened, and they don't remember it. And then also the FBI talking about how many people along that stretch of highway were killed. And yet no one has the impression of that time period being about that, which made me then wonder, are these people not remembering, or were they not noting the people in the first place? And if they're not noting the people in the first place, is that why it would so easily draw a predator? Because that would be self-fulfilling, that it would be more dangerous, because so the absence of narrative, not noticing somebody because of that, and then you becoming more vulnerable, fulfilling the prophecy that you shouldn't be on the road in the first place. Because I mean, I was thinking about this with like Natalie Diaz when we were talking about the continual epidemic of the disappearance of Indigenous women. And that never even makes the news. It's not even like there's an epidemic in Oregon, in Washington, in Canada. But it's, of course, a predator would go after somebody where no one's going to blink an eye, I would imagine, if they disappear.
No, it's exactly that is exactly the connection between those things. Because of the article, I've been privileged over the last, one of the weird and uncomfortable privileges, I will say, over the last years, is that I get contacted sometimes by, homicide or police department, sheriff's departments, when remains come up in various ways or other things. And I've also gotten to work with several Indigenous women's networks up in Canada, and done some sort of support and other work with certain people. And it is, so think about the levels of invisibility you're talking about there. How many times, I've written about it a little bit from a completely different angle, but like this, raised to be like, oh, the Indians are all dead. We killed them all, they're done. Right? That's an incredible erasure. Right. And then like it's erasure upon erasure upon erasure. Of course, you don't see them. I mean, I can think of no greater layering of every level of invisibility than a Native American woman, an Indigenous woman on the road in those settings. Right. And of course, predators are on it like that. And so, so that narrative, we don't have the placeholders that say, oh, I remember you, you're this type, I saw you on the road. It's just not a placeholder. It's not attached to story to us. And, and I think we'll get into this with the Great Offshore Grounds. I have real mixed feelings about things being attached to a story or not.
Yes, I do want to get into that.
There's a real double-edged side of that. But when something is not attached to any kind of story, it's just an object in the wind. It's not placed into anything that memory is trained to hold.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, I'm going to read another line and then ask you another question about this. So you say, Siddhartha wants liberation. Dante wants Beatrice. Frodo wants to get to Mount Doom. We all want something. Quest is elemental to the human experience. And even reading that, however, I get the feeling that your answer with regards to female quest narratives is not simply to replace a male hero with a female heroine. So my two questions for you are, one, how are quest narratives in your mind the same or different than heroes' journeys? And two, how does the structure of story change, at least for you, when you shape a quest narrative around a woman rather than a man?
Those are both very deep questions. First, I want one small digression around that. When this piece came out, it came out in the American Reader, and it was called Green Screen. And as you read it, but it got picked up also by Salon, who retitled it "Why Are There No Women Kerouacs?" And it went everywhere that way. And I got a whole rash of feedback on people angry at me for not recognizing that there were women writers writing about the road out there. And that was just because of the title that they put onto it. My question was never, why are there no women Kerouacs? Why aren't there women iconic narratives, right? Not writers, not experiences. There's experience out there. And what I mean, I am getting to your question. What I mean by that is that if I'm the average person on a road and I am looking at that man on the road, even if I haven't read this book or that book, like I know what I know Frodo, like I can recognize that kind of character. I have like places for that in story. And I don't have that for women. So the fact that like one or two people wrote a really stellar book about some times they took, traveling together through Russia in the late 90s. I mean, like it's irrelevant to we're talking about deeply grooved human, iconic narratives, right? So can you build that outside of a hero's journey model? There's that's a rut that's pretty deeply dug at this point in terms of like what becomes a mass mythic understanding of something, but I don't think it's inevitable. And I think that we have to change how we look at quest. Because the fundamental problem, like there's a beauty to the hero's journey, right? Which is it can at its best make mundane, horrific, annoying, frustrating, or devastating things seem part of a piece that is moving somewhere, that has a purpose and a point, that should you make the right choices, a win is guaranteed, right? Like that's a fundamental thing. And it can really pull people out of other stories. Like you use one story to pull people out of other stories. The downside, and I think this is where you get in all sorts of question of privilege and like how it functions and why it can't function the same way. The downside is, I've been reading a lot of Vonnegut again recently. And, the sort of, when you decide that every single person around you is like a machine who showed up to like interact with you in this moment for this personal reason, like there's a quality of hero's journey that makes everybody a symbolic object. You are my obstacle, you are my this, you are my that. And so there's so it's really, I think what is true is that the hero's journey is really just so much the white man's journey. Like it really strongly comes out of that a lot of times. And when we look at other kinds of, so how do you do when you write around a woman? I don't find that I can write it in the same way because I don't even find I can think of it in the same way. The hero's journey lacks one of the most fundamental truths and that I can think of, which is doubling back and doubling down. One of the things in this book that I looked at a lot was how do you show character arc when fundamentally they're doubling down? Like there's no, like in the way we think about the hero's journey, what they learned, who they become in the end, like all of these machinations. What do you do when it's like doubling back? Anyway.
Well, another thing that I think of from an interview that I was reading of yours too was how when you read Paul Bowles' The Sheltering Sky, how it blew your mind that when the main male characters were dead, the story continued with the woman who goes out into the desert. It's my favorite part of the book, and it's so unexpected, and there's something thrilling. It's not a doubling back, but it's forging a new path that is like completely outside of the form. Mm-hmm. Like everything that you expect that's going to happen, all of a sudden it's something else. And it feels like the rhythm, the pace, the pacing, everything about it seems to shift all of a sudden in that book. It's very wild. I could see why that would have been, for someone starved for female quest narratives, a potentially revelatory moment.
It was, and I think that pacing is of necessity different. And then it comes back to the question you raised started with, which was, there are many more possibilities than death, and rape on the road. And yet those are also still possibilities, and they are very real possibilities. And because of that, the things that have to be done, the way things have to be managed is built in the story, the same way poverty is built into a story. Like when somebody said to me recently, like, well, ironically, your character is the only thing they think about are money. And I'm like, yeah, everybody's got no money and has to get from point A to B. All they think about is money. Like, how, what I mean? It's like, there's a way that things just take on a completely different rhythm from the complexity of how do you go from this is my idea to this is my action, is everything about the power you have in the social world to make that happen. And so, depending on whether that's, a woman traveling on a road, whether that's, somebody trying to do anything that takes a financial reach, it's going to change the pacing of how we tell stories because of that.
Yeah. Well, in one interview, someone brought up, in one interview, you bring up that someone said to you, I don't know how to put this, but you write like a dude. And the interviewer then asked you if you thought that was offensive when they said this. And I found your answer really interesting and illuminating, actually. You said that you grew up with a lot of strong women role models, and you write with a certain authority because of them. And that feeling of authoritativeness from a writer is almost always associated with men in the culture. And so perhaps the writing like a dude is coming from the sense of this feeling that you're writing from a place of authority. Am I paraphrasing you right?
Yeah, I think that's really close. I think there's, the conversation that came out of had two pieces that I'd want to bring into it, which was the person who had said you write like a dude also said to me, I've never met, he had been teaching a lot in MFAs at that point, and he said, I have never yet met, he said, every woman writer I've ever met, no matter how good, no matter how confident, and he brought this up because I was expressing the same issue, has this thing, this is how he got me to write the truck stop killer piece. He said, everybody doubts it's their right to tell the story. It's all, like every woman, it's just like you ask them and they're like, I'm not sure if it's my story to tell. I feel like I'm not, like, I'm not sure I'm the right one. I'm not sure I'm the this. And he's like, I have never once met a single guy in any MFA I've ever been who's ever doubted for 1 second it was his right to tell any story he wanted to tell. And he said, and I don't understand that. He was coming from a real place of like, I just don't know how to break that spell. Like, I don't know what that is. So I think on the one hand, I did come from that, very sort of, my mother wielded power like a man, in a lot of ways. I do too in social spaces. A lot of times it's what I've seen. It's, and I always, you can talk about that, but there's,
well, for what it's worth, I don't feel like you write like a man, but both of your books have these super resilient women in them, and unconventionally so.
However, I want to jump in on one thing. I don't feel like I write like a man. I think the authority is that sense of authority is just like it is something that's somehow recognizable, meaning like it's a kind of directness, but I never got put into women's fiction with Zazen, even though all the characters are women except for one.
Which is also true with your new book.
But with my new book, it's listed as women, as sisters fiction, women's fiction, domestic fiction, divorce fiction, and I have been completely separated into that world.
I'm shocked, actually.
Yeah, I'm not happy about it. I mean, I know it sounds like petty, but it's like, no, it bothers me.
Yeah.
It bothers me. That's how it's like, you look in the libraries, it's domestic fiction. It is just simply the fact of having anything so there's been a feminizing, and I was afraid of it in the writing, and I chose to take the path I took, and I was right that there was a fear for it, but it's one I'm up for.
That's so wild. I mean, I would never have dreamed that would have happened to this book. I mean, because you do have almost all women as main protagonists in the book. Super resilient. Motherhood is a part of the book, but for no character in the book is motherhood central or all-encompassing or even self-defining, really. And the main man in the book, Essex, who's a street kid adopted by Kirsten, when he's 11, and who becomes the brother of the two main characters, the sisters Cheyenne and Livy. He's raised entirely by women. And there's this really funny moment where we learn that one of his formative texts is reading Little Women, which is so great. Like, so, I mean, his whole way to like make meaning from the world is coming from that fact. But I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you a question as sort of a lead in to talking more specifically about the book. And it's a question about America. And then I want to take that question of America and bring it into what is one of the more unusual aspects of the central family. So first, I feel like there's this particularly storied tradition in America of road narratives. The romanticization of open spaces, of trains, of cars on the road, of wilderness and wildness, of the possibility of reinvention and living a life away from or escaping the pressures of history. But what is interesting to me about your book, The Great Offshore Grounds, is that it seems to both join this tradition and critique it, or perhaps to join it in order to critique it. I'm not sure. But the novel feels like a very American novel, and a novel that is evoking the story that America tells itself to punch holes in it. And I didn't know, I just wanted to hear what you thought of that take. Does that seem right to you? And if not, tell us about that aspect, because it feels in a way like you're embracing an American road narrative, but also making us very aware of the shadow that it casts.
Yeah, I mean, it is right that I am intentionally doing both those things. However, what is also true is that it's an honest project. The way I write about America in my mind, that's how it just comes to be. But what I'm drawn to is the places where my own desire and critique align, and there is no answer, right? Where I'm both very drawn to and I'll talk about more widely in an adventure tradition too in a second, but like where I'm very drawn to something, to that big expansive story of what the possibility of America could be, which is, up to the point of like elements of exceptionalism. And at the same time, very in contact with all of the death and danger and, lying and obfuscation, like all of the darkness and shadow that is equally a part of it. And I write into the places where I can't find full resolution, where like, maybe I know I should be here, but I kind of am also here, but then I'm here in this way, but then there's also something great. And so when I started out writing this, what I wanted to do in part was I really had to try to say to myself, because I was in a very dark place, in some ways I feel like I could say I've always been in a really dark place about America, because I was raised, I'm basically a red diaper baby, and was raised with COINTELPRO and all, and like, I'm not somebody who came to that in college. I came with an analysis at a very early age, when I was 5, I don't recommend this for parenting, but when I was 5, we would play Vietnamese kids, hiding from the terrible US soldiers who were trying to burn and kill us. You know what I mean? Like that was like my concept of play at 5, because that sense of empathy and that sense of awareness that my family had brought me to like know what was happening in the war in a very non-age appropriate for somebody who can't do anything about it way, was haunting my dreams and my imagination and my lack of place and not sure where I should be in that. You could see that. So that's just normal human stuff. So I didn't come to this like American story as something that was fed to me like apple pie that I slowly in college began to untangle and then had analysis. You know what I mean? Like I came from a very other side of it. So then the project sometimes for me is there anything worth saving? What is there that's worth saving?
Right. Which is the question of Della and Zazen. should I leave the country? Should I stay despite things falling apart? Should I even help speed up the falling apart?
Right.
But the reason why I wanted to start with this question of America and its upsides and downsides, which are not often experienced by the same people,
Yes.
and also of national and cultural myth making, because I wanted to bring that into the central family in the novel, because it feels like the upsides and downsides of a culture trying to escape history are baked into the story of this family. So I was hoping you could talk about this extremely unusual and mysterious origin story for the two sisters, Cheyenne and Livy, in the book, as sort of our beginning into sort of unpacking the story that you've created in the novel.
Okay. So Cheyenne and Livy are half sisters who share a birthday. And the woman who has raised them, her name is Kirsten, was a 19-year-old pagan kind of goth girl in the early 90s when she got pregnant. And she was in a relationship with a grad student, and it was an open relationship, and another woman became friends, and like their periods synced up, and they ended up getting pregnant at the same time. And one woman really didn't want to
by the same
man. Sorry. And,
yes.
One woman didn't really want to be a mother, and Kirsten, for kind of a set of half-baked reasons, being 19 and newly vegetarian and suddenly having this sort of like squeamishness about life in any way, couldn't simply conceive of the idea of aborting, like from where she came from all this stuff. So she agrees, after some throws of the I Ching with the other woman, that she will take both girls when they're born. They don't know they're girls then, but she will take both kids, and the other woman will go on, and that she will never tell them which one was which. That she will raise them both, and the other woman gets a total pass. She's gone. She's out of the picture. Yeah. And so when the novel starts, the women are 33, and they're starting at a very particular point in their life, and I won't go into the details of that, but that's the founding myth. What happens is, when Kirsten decides she's going to do this, the grad student kid, he's not a kid, he's older than her. The grad student bails and just sort of, gets out of the situation, and occasionally comes and, pays a hospital bill here and there, but has had substantially no. He does at one point bring, when they're younger, he brings the girls to his work in this software company. It's kind of like show and tell from his like wild polyamorous days to sort of, I think they say, vet him as an unconventional thinker, but there's like no connection. They haven't seen him since they were 14 at the beginning of the novel, and it opens basically on his wedding to a younger woman.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned right at the beginning how you explore your ambivalence around story making and myth making, and I feel like this is a prime area. And to me, like, America tries to imagine it doesn't have a mother itself, that it doesn't matter who its mother is, and I think of Whitman inventing new forms by willfully pretending that no poetry existed before him, and the way we glorify freedom and self-invention over and against countries that seem to have more rigid caste systems. It feels like that's all somehow intertwined with this family too, because we have Kirsten, who invents a narrative purpose for her two daughters, also sort of out of nothing. And it's a mythology about the North Star that sort of imbues their lives with a sense of destiny. And I was hoping you could talk about that, both sides of that, the purpose of that, and then maybe the ways in which it doesn't quite do what she's hoping it's going to do.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that, because at different periods, and we will talk about this, I'm sure, a little bit, in the very long time of me writing this novel, I came to understand it in different ways. What am I trying to do here? And in some ways, I felt like Kirsten was part of creating a founding mother. She was a founding mother in the way that she set herself up. And that there was, the way that we find out, it's a very small part of the book, but that when she cut ties with her family, she had told the girls when they were little that they were immigrants, because, and they actually thought they were real immigrants, but she was just, Kirsten was just kind of like, we left the dead old world behind. We're here in the new world. Like, nobody, so they actually introduced themselves as first generation in the like second grade when they weren't, like, and so there is this, her as a founding mother, and there is her as like, what's the unseen. And that's one of the things Cheyenne, one of the sisters, look, what if there's another history to have? What if that other history is invisible now, but you can find it? What if you can't find it, but you can make it? What does it mean to make it? Are you constructing yourself? So Kirsten is definitely somebody who believes you can construct. Like if you just tell the stories and you take someone, you raise them in it, they will believe it and have the things you did not have. They will take for granted that which you will have to fake. And I think a lot of people in social justice movements know the difference, right? You can see a lot, like my daughter's 18 in 5 days, and you can see a lot of this kind of like, she takes as like absolutely solid, fact stuff that I think people in my generation are like, this is an ideal, this is a vision, this is where we're going, so there's, and so she wants to create a sense of autonomy and purpose and specialness for the daughters, and a freedom and a pioneering spirit for that is obviously a very complex word, right? But that's kind of how she's creating something. She wants to make a new world. And at the same time, the number one thing that she's seen as the difference is that people come from the upper classes automatically have a story built in that their life matters, that their changes can be glorious, that destiny holds something for them, that people are on their way to teach or serve them, and that there is always this, that there's something of greatness that is always unfolding if they but follow it. And she wants to give that to her daughters because she sees that poor kids don't have that, in her, like, but she's like that sense of, we all have to watch out where the like King's Parade is going, if it rolls over you, but like the King's Parade's not watching out for, like there's a difference. And so she thinks if she instills this belief system, that they will think that they are worthy of greatness and that they will not expect less from themselves. But not even like emotionally, like wishy-washy worthy of greatness, more like they will expect that they can have a place and meaning in the same way.
Yeah. I mean, this is interesting and complicated because it feels like Cheyenne is the daughter. One of the daughters is upset with her mom's obsession with this hero's journey or personal journey, which she does associate with rich people, but the need for it, as you say, is coming from poverty. And so it becomes like, there's this thing that you say in writing about your own hitchhiking when you were 15, that your survival depended upon some kind of narrative to spell out a potential for you beyond death, which then raises the question, is it better to have a simplistic and ultimately problematic narrative than no narrative? And maybe Kirsten's, stepping into the idea that this story, however you analyze it retrospectively, is going to save my daughters. But I wanted to, I just feel like this is one example of the way poverty is shaping the narrative of the book. And we're talking about a poverty that is extreme enough that the characters are making their own tampons because they can't afford to buy them in a store. And there are characters who have never been on a plane or in a hotel. and there are characters who join the army for financial security. But I wonder if another way the narrative is shaped by poverty is the way the characters are all keeping secrets from each other. And I don't know if I'm reading into this or whether this is there. So I just I'll put it out there. You tell me what you think, but there's a lot of things that happen between these characters who care for each other, whether it's a sexual assault or a health diagnosis, that they don't share with each other. And to me, it feels like they're so under-resourced and so overextended, not just financially, but ultimately emotionally, living on the edges of their own abilities to cope with their own things, let alone the others, that it almost feels like the withholding is an act of care.
It is. That you're 100% right. It is exactly what that's intended to be, which is there's not enough resources. There's no resilience. How can I know you, and I know how hard it is going to be for you to hear what I'm about to tell you. And once I tell you, you won't be able to do anything about it. You won't be able to change anything. Then I'm carrying that too. You're carrying that. Or worse, you give me the one only resource you have to try to make something better, and it's still not enough. And now you don't have it and I don't have, so they are very close. And the closeness is marked by the things they don't share with each other, because they are trying not to overburden each other to the point of complete annihilation in so many ways. And it causes all sorts of problems, but it's not because they're distant, and it would be very different. It's because they are poor, and the resources and the levels at which things are sort of, where just the general state of living is hard. And there's not an easy, if you've ever been in the situation, really are without resources in something, and somebody who means well says, why don't you just do this? And you start to explain, well, because A, B, and C, and D can't do this without doing that. Well, why don't you just do this? And you can sit there and politely spend a lot of time with people as they very generously walk around what seem to be obvious options to make change. And at the end of that exchange, everybody's miserable, right? And then what happens in that moment is interesting, because a lot of times the person who's offering, well, you could do this, you could do this, you could do this, gets frustrated and says, well, clearly you don't want to change because it's too painful to say, the barriers here, I cannot solve that easily. On the other hand, I guess it is in the details. The hardness of the life that they are in is in the details. It's not into the, here's one thing that fixes it. It is in the details. And there's no more, I have decided these last years, the height of privilege in any form is the privilege to be abstract. That is the highest mark of privilege to me, to be abstract, to say, I'm going to have this one litmus test political issue and, scorch the earth if that's not met, to be at whatever level, or the ability to say, to be able to be above the details. That is related to privilege. And so these are characters who do care about each other. They are very flawed people. They are not dour about their circumstances. They're not dour characters. They have, some of them are incredibly talented at certain kinds of grift. There's also a love of that, I think, in the book, that I share a love for, people who are kind of grifters and the kind of sketch along some of that, so they're not pure characters, but I think poverty's in the reality of their situation is in everything. And I think the trickiness is the characters are very different in how they take it. Livy, one of the sisters, is very much more bought into this idea of, she's bought into the American idea of bootstraps enough that her big goal is to get to where nobody owes her, like she doesn't owe anybody a single thing, and she's got her boat, she's got her place, and that's it, but she doesn't have it anywhere in her to imagine that she's actually going to get out of working class. She just wants to not be sinking. She just wants to not be owing. And whereas I think Cheyenne, she went through a marriage with somebody who was at a different social station. And what part of her anger about these heroes' journey stories of her moms is that they didn't work. What she saw is she could not pass, even with those things, that the real difference was deeper than that. And that she was marked as somebody who was not from that class at a much more deep level than she could pass with. And that's where so she was more of a true believer in that. And then, it backfired.
I want to take a moment to talk about one of the things that we see and watch a character experience that not everybody in the book learns about, or not at the same time. And that is, there's a rape in the book that happens in real time. And the way you portray it and its aftermath, I thought was really rare, I guess. I don't know that I can connect it to other portrayals. And the way the character responds is so outside the normal cultural tropes around sexual assault narratives. And I know you've thought a lot about it. And generally, I know you have an older essay, The Collapsible Woman. So it made me want to ask you, as a writer, what considerations you were going through as you wrote this thread of the book, what you did and didn't want to do in terms of portrayal, and how it affected the character, or what you wanted to avoid versus what you wanted to write into that wasn't there in literature at large.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, as you know, the book went through some transition with publishers. And one of the big sort of moments where I realized how far apart I was from an editor at one point was that their perception of what that scene was so radically different than my intention. And they hated it with such passion that they could barely talk to me. And, and felt like it was there just for shock value.
Is that why they hated it?
Yeah. They felt like it was there for shock value. And I remember having this discussion with this person and saying, look, and this person was very smart and everything, but kind of a blue blood a little bit, and I said, look, for many women in upper middle class New York or other things like that, sexual assault, child molestation, all these things, they're not just, they're in rich people as well as poor people, but not in the same ways and same degrees, because it has to do with accessibility, visibility, and like who's protecting whom and where all that power is. So, settings, child molestation is a little different, but when you're talking about like straight up, rape and assault, you'll hear stories of women who have, in the upper echelons of culture, who may have had a lot of experiences, with molestation, but the fewer with straight up rape, where it's like, okay, there was something in college and this happened, or this happened with my first employer, I never told anybody. And what I said to this person is that you have to understand that for a good 30% of the poorest women in this country, it's just a bad Friday night. I can't tell you how many times I've met women who, if they called it rape, they would say they'd been raped 30 or 40 times. It's a bad Friday night. You want to talk about story and how story allows you to survive even when it's not a helpful story? The most fundamental thing about this, when you look at Trump and women and things like that, is like, think of all the women who, if they had to look at what he was doing and call it rape or sexual assault, sexual abuse, would have to look at everybody else in their entire family, society, everybody who ever done it, and name it as the same thing. And then what do you do? Right. So there's a different way that because of the invisibility, because you don't have think about everything that economic resilience goes into. I'm assaulted and it's my boss. What if I can't afford to get another job? I'm assaulted. I need time to like take time off to try to get, everything else. Well, I don't have time to take time off, or like, is it even considered assault in that? You know what I mean? Like there's so many cultures where, like so many subcultures where it's like not even considered assault. We were drinking, we were doing that, right? So there's this constant, like set of layers to this where, I mean, it's true for me in my own experience. And I have an older sister that I found through Ancestry, which is a very fascinating way to find a whole extra sister. And she and I talked about this through things as well, where it's just like, yeah, we feel a lot of times we're like, you have this, it was like, yeah, you could call it that. Yeah, it kind of was. I'd call it that today. I didn't call it that then. In this case, the character is very self-sufficient. Right. And she hates the idea that anybody could decide who she was ever at any time. And so it's particularly difficult for her to figure out what to do in that moment. And I wanted to leave space for other ways of reacting because I think that it's become so prescribed.
Well, the reason I'm surprised that the editor was shocked is your characters are also putting themselves in professions that are overwhelmingly male professions too. So like you're in a situation like of 9-to-1 men to women in confined settings. Also, that wouldn't make that shocking to me.
We saw things differently on what a feminist novel was. I think we both understood that this was in many ways a feminist novel. I take that to mean there are humans who are women in the story. And I think she wanted a feminist, she understood and wanted that. And yet we were generationally a little bit different and had very different ideas of what that feminism meant and what it looked like. So for instance, she wanted all the male characters out because she felt that heightened the feminism of the novel. And I felt like my female characters are strong enough to stand on their own in a world where there are also men and still have it be about them. And like, so I was very much like that. And so we would have these different debates, right? That I think were in heart generational. And I think when it came to the rape, she saw the character as living in a world that was largely male dominated, and that she was out in this world and felt like I was undercutting, that I was continuing an anti-feminist trope by saying that she was that she would get raped in that world. And then she found the way that I wrote about it to be, so I write about it in a way where it happens very quickly. And it's just, it moves extremely fast. And she found that she thought that was a lazy way or to do shock value writing. I think whatever it was, she had strong feelings about it. And that's how we got into that conversation. Whereas my point was, a lot of times this stuff is just like, you're getting cheese out of the walk-in. You're getting, like you're in one situation or another.
Well, in your own nonfiction, I know there were scenes when you're being picked up by a trucker and you wake up from sleeping and he's got his hand down your shirt, or
it's just instant, like, and so, yeah. And so I think, it was a generational, I think primarily, and a perspective difference, but the one we were talking about with poverty is a big one because, when I talk for real to my friends who come straight out of working class backgrounds, we're talking in numbers 20, 30, 10, and they're a lot more able to talk about it, ironically, than the women and friends of mine that I've talked to who come from where it's treated as a more rarefied experience rather than a thing that happens.
Right.
And so, that's, again, it goes to story. Do you want it to be treated like a rarefied experience? Yeah. Do you want it to, but does that give space for the women for whom it's not a rarefied experience to like interact, and they need to survive? What if they can't get counseling and they can't take time off and they can't make it the center of their lives, and they're going to have to live with these people or work with these people? They need to build something inside themselves that allows them to thrive and be there and have a sense of humor and a perspective. Yeah.
Well, I'd like people to hear a little bit of the book. If we could we could have you read a little bit.
Okay. So this is from a chapter called Irish Lord, which is about Livy. For the past several summers, Livy had worked longlining for halibut in the Gulf of Alaska. The family that employed her ran a small outfit out of Ketchikan. Their boat, a marginally buoyant piece of fiberglass. Their skipper, a third-generation fisherman utterly without instinct. As a student of what not to do, Livy studied the man as she would a rare and dying plant. When he got excited, she too felt the thrill and paid particularly close attention. "The fish are there," he'd yell. "I feel it." He was always wrong, pointing at a vague patch of glassy black sea and shouting, "Down there!" It was the moment he lived for, though it underscored their ever-bleakening prospects. It was his moment, his to take. Down there, yes. Down there with the starfish and the Irish lords. Down with the albino space shrimp. The most unimaginable things came up on those lines, and none of them were halibut. Over time, Livy learned where the fish were by where the captain didn't go. After months of blisters and vomiting over the side of the rail, Livy was often glad when the season ended and she returned to Seattle and went back to driving cab at night, floating through the intersections at bar closing time, fishtailing on the barest shimmer of rain in a Crown Victoria, making money, her own captain at last. Yet no eternity exists more vividly than a 5 a.m. in a Dairy Queen parking lot, holding some jackass's empty wallet as collateral while he tries to borrow his fare from the dealer. This was how it went for 3 years. Back and forth, migrational. But now Alaska had fallen through. After a winter of pull-tab binges in Juneau, the family she'd always worked for had sold their boat, converted to Mormonism, and moved south in the embrace of the church. Without another Alaska connection, Livy was out of luck. Driving cab was changing too. Every jerk with the car was a cab driver now, and all the real money was gone from the game. So she got a job refurbishing vintage yachts at a marina on Lake Union. The position flew under the radar of the state minimum wage requirements by claiming to be training. Here's a scraper, there's the paint, go forth. So getting up to minimum wage took 3 months, but she worked without supervision, and that was worth a lot. Then in the early spring, Livy found her basement studio, built without permits and well below code, that absorbed 80% of her income. But it was the first time in her life that she'd had any real privacy, until Cheyenne showed up and ruined it. Now her boxes of books and records filled the corner. Her chatter was constant. She boiled all the macaroni and drank all the Folgers. With every economic microaggression, she created a soft and persistent financial pressure, reminding Livy of how tentative existence was. A broken arm could shatter Livy's livelihood. Bronchitis could soak up an entire paycheck. One minor bike accident, that's it. Watch below. Because that's all it would take to end up on her mother's couch. Livy began walking to and from work just to be alone, an hour each way. She walked along the ship canal, under the Aurora Bridge, along the edge of the lake, and sometimes thinking of it as the edge of a vast and horizonless sea instead.
We've been listening to Vanessa Veselka read from The Great Offshore Grounds. So you mentioned this in the beginning, unprompted, about people being surprised about you being the author of different things, particularly between your fiction and nonfiction, that it's the same author. And I wanted to ask you a question in light of that. Before we talk more about the story, I wanted to talk about the language and the syntax, sort of in the spirit of reinvention, because one of the things that's fascinating to me about having read Zazen and now The Great Offshore Grounds is that I recognize thematic resonances between the book. I recognize sort of kindred engagements with America. I recognize characters that I think could inhabit either of the books. But nevertheless, on the level of the line, if we think about the music of the sentences or the wave of the mind underneath the meaning of the words that Virginia Woolf talks about, I don't know that I would know that these two books were written by the same writer on that level. It's almost like you reinvented your musical signature from one book to the next. And I don't know if that rings true to you, but if it does, I was wanting to hear about it. Also, you're a musician, so I'm curious because the music of the language is really different. It's remarkable, actually. It does feel like a reinvention, and I didn't know what that was all about.
So it's a combination of things. Yes, as I said earlier, I do look at everything, and I'm learning as I'm writing what is the right language to tell this story in. And that's happening at the same time as I'm going, oh, wait a minute, is it this story or is it that story? Or you know what I mean? Like it's you're digging in deeper and going like, oh, it's that story. Okay, and reorienting. I'm also looking at what is the language that can contain that story that's going to give me the most range. This very simple answer, which is not sufficient, between the language shifts in these two books is one's first person, and that's the sound of Della's voice, and the other one is a third person narrator, and it has a different sense of scope that needs to be laid from the beginning. However, that's only one aspect that sort of like expedites, or expedites not the right word, that sort of accelerates the polarization of those voices. I think there always was this sense for me as I was, I was not somebody who wrote and wrote and wrote and then started publishing. I was somebody who played music and played music and played music and then started publishing. And so there's not a gap where I have tons of material I was experimenting with and kind of came up to something. So my whole learning curve has been public. And in the way that I tended to write nonfiction, fell more into, my own internal way of trying to show scope, and hearing things in a very particular way. And yes, I write very sonically. And I knew I was going to need, I like your way of talking about a musical set. I knew I was going to need another way to convey the story I wanted to convey. I knew I wasn't going to do it with the tools that I had learned and the ways I had learned to tell stories in Zazen, or in some of my short stories up to that, those were all first person as well. And I knew I had to do this in third person. And so the very first problem I had was that I hated third person when I first encountered it. I hated writing in it because I felt like it was horribly normalizing, right? Like as soon as you go to third person, if you get too, rhythmic or particular at the line level, then all of a sudden it's not third person anymore. It's this narrator that's talking to you in a very stylized way, and you want to know who they are. Like it really defined to have a third person, be a third person. It normalizes language in a lot of ways. And you can take a lot of other experimental and that's, I think, where people who like to write in third person but want to be more experimental, they go to form. But there's still like at the level of voice in third person, it is just like it was like being put in a cage all the time, and then going like, and I tried all these different ways of like, how do I not give up the range I want to have for the sounds I want to make? Because I think in sound and rhythm. And so it was really hard to start to sort it out. And I went through, and I'm not totally sold 100% on where I ended up. I went through phases of there being, I think initial versions of some of this were a lot more, the merging of the narrator and the characters was a lot more extreme and disorienting at different times. And I had to reel some of that, so it was always finding this thing. And the truth is, there is a narrator in this novel. Like the narrator, I started calling it the accusatory third. Like, it's like, well, what it sort of occasionally just turns and accuses the reader of doing something terrible, or like, or saying, well, like, and this is how things are. Like there is that breach that happens. The songs, the shanties that are in here, are definitely part of the narrator's humor, the narrator's voice. So there is a quality of narration. So not being able to access the rhythms and the moves and the ways that I could, get to insight quickly in one way or not, that I had accessible in the first person, I had to understand. So then I was stuck with this problem, which was like, how do I find and hear the natural sense of music that makes it work for me, that allows me to do this? So I had to dig into what that was. So I think that it really is a function of the third person exploration, and probably the elements that I went for, to some degree, were coming out of, I wrote a piece called Fort of Young Saplings. And I wrote that in the middle of writing this. And they share a telling of the Battle of Sitka, which is a very meaningful thing that, the Fort of Young Saplings explains why it's meaningful to me, but it's also in here, and I wrote them in two different ways. But I think that I was starting to discover the rhythms that I could use in third person in certain ways in that interaction. So it has a very different musical quote, but I don't think the next book will have the same either. Like I really don't. Like I really do look at what's the language.
Well, let me ask you about the size of the book, because I know when I would see you, you said you wanted to write a big fat 19th century style novel, like a Dostoevsky book. It's not that big now. It's 400 pages, but I think at one point it might have been six or 700 pages before you edited it. And I remember it made me think of a Facebook discussion that happened among smart people, among writers, or so I thought they were smart, that was started with, and was mainly people trashing long novels as just another example of manspreading, of sort of like the maximalist impulse. They'd point at David Foster Wallace or at Knausgaard's My Struggle as sort of this exasperating gendered phenomenon. And my one like brief entry into the conversation wasn't to argue that there wasn't a gendered lineage among size. I mean, I even think if we're going back to like poetry, like Whitman versus Dickinson, and the way their lines are, and the way the legacies, like if we could look at Alice Notley and Jory Graham wanting to claim the long line away from Whitman and Ginsberg. I don't know if they explicitly were doing that, but I also feel like there's something inherently pleasurable about long, where you can't, I'll use the ocean metaphor since your book is there, but where it feels like you can't see the shore that you've left from, and you can't yet see the shore that you're going to end up at. So if it's long enough where you feel like there's an illusion that the experience isn't going to end at some point in the middle, that you are like completely in it. And something to do with the book being thick and big has to do with that. That's my pleasure. And I think of so many great books that I love that are large books, and including George Eliot and other women who've written large books that I love. But I wondered what the attraction was for you. Why are you thinking, okay, big fat 19th century tradition novel?
Well, I think it was, what you're talking about in some ways is a bit of a conflation of two things that I was thinking. And one is, in the beginning, I was like, yeah, I want to write my own 19th century novel in my way. And this very much is that. Like, I remember I had a really funny night with my boyfriend because in bed, and he was watching the Great Courses Plus on something about like English, 19th century. I was half asleep, and I just heard him turn on the thing, and he was listening to it. He said, "Here are the main elements of." Then he's like, uncertain parentage, trying to find their status in time, and will is usually read at the, and it just starts to go down, and he just starts to like look over to me as he's like, this, didn't you? I'm like, yes, in fact I did, but so there was that sort of playing with it, but it came out of the more simple question for me, which was, what am I afraid to write? What books do I love the most? Why can't I go there? You know, like that was the impulse to explore that. The length thing, when I was first thinking that, I was thinking of something like 350 pages. I wasn't thinking of like, you know, huge. As I began to write, it really began to grow. And in part because by nature, I am a maximalist. And there were so many things that were in the stories. And I remember also at that time in trying to was that the way that I would get talked to about it sometimes, I felt like there was a way that that women get talked to around long works that is different. And it reminded me much more about how people talk about women's bodies and fat. Like this idea that like you're out of control, like you've lost, like I don't know what's going. You gotta, you know, how are you? I would always hear from people. I say like, well, it's about 600 right now. They're like, oh my God, how are you going to get it down? It's like, are you going to diet in time for your wedding? It was like never. It was so strange, that kind of way of constantly hearing that. Women have written long novels forever. They just ghettoize them into, you know, genre fiction. The question isn't, do women get to write long novels? It's, can we take women's writing seriously enough as an intellectual project and still allow them to retain, quote, literary fiction, you know, standing in any way when they do? The shortening of this novel came for a different reason, which was I had an excellent conversation with an agent who is very, very smart and represents, you know, she's one of the big agents of like probably most of like the literary, you know, writers of color that have been like the big, I mean, she's been around a lot. She's very sharp and opinionated. She's a really good reader. And she had read a draft of this at the height of its size. And she gave me the greatest gift, which is, you know, because everybody's like, this thing has to be cut in half, or this had, you know, and she wasn't like that. She's like, yeah, it'll probably have to come down, but here's why. And she was able to explain, you know, in her words to me, she said, every single thing that you're doing is, you know, this is what she said, is interesting and it's strong and it's working. And I get lost in it. And I can't, she's basically said, I'm losing the noise in the signal. She's like, I don't know what you care about most. I can go in any of these directions, but you're not telling me which one I'm supposed to go into. And so it was more of a cueing problem. And so when I went, that was very, very helpful to me because it allowed me to go and think, what is you know, I was in this very maximalist encyclopedic place. Does the American project work? What is the road? What is space? Like, what are these characters doing? You know, and I know all those connections, but then forced me to, so I took it back in this way and I thought, okay, I'm going to edit it from this perspective. If I were to give you, David, my book and say, read this, what is it that if you didn't get it, I would have failed? Like if you didn't, and if I were to say to you, what's this book about? And you couldn't say it was about one of these things, that I would have failed my job. Like, what are the things I care about that much? What are the things I need to hear back from you if you tell me what this book is about? And I realized, and so I began to look at a lens through all that. And through that, I began to choose, you know, I began to make those different choices with it. And I asked a friend of mine recently who read every iteration of this book. She's one of these people who reads super fast and always likes to read multiple iterations. She has read every iteration of this book. And I said, how does it feel to you to see it in final form when you were so attached to the like 720 page version of it, you know, and all these things? And she just said, you know, and I think this is maybe younger kids who do more gaming, but she was like, it's more like a video. It's like there are rooms that were open to me before that are not open to me now, but they're still there. And she says, it doesn't feel any different than the first day I read it. There's just different rooms I can go into now that I couldn't go into before. And ones I went into before are gone.
I love this friend of yours.
So expansion doesn't have to be this and contraction. I do think women are just talked to totally differently about it. talk to it with fear of madness and control, fear of like taking too much space, fear of like, just a lot of that stuff. And then my editor is fantastic, and the agent I ended up working with in the end was absolutely stunning, and I had lots of help. But fundamentally,
yeah, I mean, I'm gonna ask you a question that I think maybe you've already answered with what you said about the narrator, the accusatory narrator. But I wanted to ask you about writing a book that feels very political and historical, but where none of the characters themselves are political.
yeah.
Because that's very unlike Zazen. So this is where I think of Moby Dick, speaking of large novels, not just because the book opens with a sermon at a lighthouse along the coast that makes me think of the sermon at the beginning of Moby Dick, not just because Essex, the main male character, shares the name with the ship that inspired Melville to write Moby Dick, a ship that was sunk by a sperm whale and whose few survivors in smaller boats lived off of the dead, and then drew lots to see which half would be killed so the other half could eat them. Not just because the book has boats and sailors and whales itself, but also because, like Moby Dick, which can be read just as a tale of a megalomaniac captain's obsession with a whale, but is also a book that is about America, and it's about the bottomless hunger of extractive capitalism. Mm-hmm. You could even say it's about peak oil at a time pre-electricity when the world entire was lit by the oil of whales. So whereas Della in your first book could be a character in your second book, she's unlike your characters in the second book in that she's overtly political and she has a political analysis and she's wondering what to do in relationship to her political analysis. But in this book, there's this atmosphere that is sort of infuses the book with the afterlives of colonialism, theft, graft, genocide, conquest. But none of the characters are actually speaking about it necessarily. And I didn't know how you pulled that off. I love this about the book. Maybe that is the accusatory narrator.
Yes.
If it is, I don't think accusatory narrator is the right word because the narrator comes in very subtly to me. I don't feel like I'm ever having a finger pointed at me.
The accusation, earlier versions, I would say it was a more accusatory narrator, not in the sense of why did you do this, but more in the sense of, but who can halt the lumbering desires of the world? There's that comes in from the beginning in the first pages. So at that sense, the narrator's always sort of teasing out those questions. So it is carried by the narrator. It's carried by the way that like history is talked about and, particularly around indigenous and genocides and sort of the sense of how place is built into it. The narrator carries that. Some character, the daughters are aware of history in some ways, in the ways that they've learned it from Kirsten. They're aware of women's history. Like they really good luck on that. Yeah. But that greater sense of what is in the dread and the grandeur and the crisis of the novel is carried by the narration. And that was a question, it was a really tricky thing to go from Zazen to this because thematically, yes, a lot of similarity. And yet I felt all the time that I was writing this deeply troubled by the fact that here in this, last 8-9 years where I had such strong political emotions myself, and there's such need to act and do things and change and participate and learn, in all of this, that I felt like here I was writing this novel that didn't have political, that was actually, it felt very apolitical compared to the directness of Zazen. And it's like, I did know, I'm like, it's more political in a way, but it's not the same. And it's not as direct. And it was really hard for me at times to see why it mattered to write it at all. And I think a lot of it was, I was in this really deep engagement of what's to save, what's the beauty, what do I know that is beautiful? Like, where are the points of aliveness? that I recognize, because I've lived outside of America too. And, I had to think of that too. Like, what are the points of aliveness that I know that are here that are not in other places that seem politically perfect, but don't have it, and so I was trying to bring in a lot, but it was a deep meditation for me. It was pretty dark times, and it did feel strange to not be writing something that was going to be, um, very overtly, directly having characters speak exactly.
I think it's weirdly more political because it feels like the political is the entire world, and which then is what we're all sort of steeped in,
right?
Regardless of whether we're thinking about it. But the book is mainly realism. There's the fairy tale aspect to the family origin, which does feel, it's not fantastical, but there's a fairy tale element to this origin story. But then you literally also have two ghosts, historical colonizing figures that appear very much on the margins with a mainly a light touch in the book. But both the narrator and the way you bring in history and these ghosts, it's sort of this, what I would say, un-American continual reinsertion of the past and its consequences and past actions and their consequences into the present moment. So unlike the American mythos of leaving the past behind and
right.
creating something anew, the past literally is haunting this book.
Yes.
By these ghosts. And I guess what I wanted to talk about was that in relationship to the other mother. Because I remember the feeling of vertigo in Zazen when the book would telescope between sort of the pressing and urgent needs of the moment and more of this geologic scope or time frame, non-human framing. And the main way I feel like you do that in the new book is with the other mother and the way she tries to disentangle herself from time and consequence through Buddhist practice. And it's something that feels, as it is embodied in her, it's something that feels simultaneously attractive and repulsive somehow. And I was hoping you could talk without spoilers about her, and also about Buddhism, I guess, also, since it is a significant presence in both books.
The question of scope, and I think how I think of it is inextricability, is deeply, complicity, inextricability. Can you untangle yourself? What are you responsible for? What is yours to carry? You're born into a country that was built on a lot of, theft and racism, and the labor of others. And yet you're born new onto this ground without having ever been able to be a part of any of those decisions. And how do you carry all of that in a way that allows you to accept what should be accepted on your shoulders and also respect the given right of every single alive thing on this planet to want to live and to want to feel like that their life is also their own. How do you put those things together, right? And those versions of those questions go throughout my mind all the time. They go through everything I've ever written. Geology, to me, I mean, I think there's a joke that Della says in Zazen where, somebody had told her that like she needed to step back and get some perspective on, or something like that, when emotional, like things are traumatic or like there's too much on fire. And she's just like, yeah, 68 million years seems to be about right. Like that's about how far back I'd have to be to have an analysis on this that doesn't get me really upset. It's right. Like, well, compared to other extinctions. So that question of how far back do you have to be? At what scope do you have to understand things to see the beauty again? is in a way that's not checked out, but that can still encompass the detail. So not so far back that there is no detail, not so close up that you can't see the beauty in it again. Like, how do you find that spot? Well, there's a lot of shortcuts to that too. And I think that, the other mother is one who is engaged in some of those shortcuts. And I find, like everything, that I'm fascinated and drawn to, I also have pretty deep, like, like there is a really gross side to, there's all the ways that people talk about detachment that is incorrect to talk about in Buddhist detachment, meaning like it's a sort of hackneyed understanding of what it actually means when you talk to Buddhists, where it's just like detachment means having no feelings. I was like, no, it's not really that. Like, that's not it. There's healthy ways of describing that. And there's ways of describing that are like, just creepy white dudes finding a reason to like not actually have sex with people that they're in relationships with. You know what I mean? Like there's all ways. I think that the noble truth, I mean, the parts of Buddhism that have always been the most powerful for me is very much the Pali Canon and the very fundamental Four Noble Truths. The earliest stories, there's no deification in it. There's no like, it is not Zen. It is not this. It is very like it. You can hear the in the mud feel of it in a lot of ways. In that world, Buddha dies of dysentery, and he has everybody watch him, so that they too know that life is like this. It's a very different thing than the iterations that come as it migrates through different cultures and becomes at once Gothic and beautiful in some ways in the Vajrayana, or very down to earth in the Zen, but having this other quality that sort of lops off other, I mean, I shouldn't go down a rabbit hole with that. But I guess what I'm saying is that then you come back to this question of poverty and privilege and things. And it's the who gets to, it's if you think of narratives as tools, these stories, they're all there. Who gets to use them? And who gets to use them to do what they already wanted to do? Who gets to use them with a different power because they have more power? And so the person who gets to go, I'm just going to walk away, or I'm just going to do this and I'm going to call it this other thing. Some people just don't get to do that. And so I think ultimately Buddhism is not a home for me, but I have learned and appreciate a lot of the teachings, particularly again in the Pali Canon, that I consider to be so true, just true about so the question of suffering. So I'm answering something specifically about the character you're talking about. This is not a character who knows suffering. So what does it mean to apply the Four Noble Truths to somebody who doesn't know what suffering means?
Or perhaps is pursuing Buddhism to avoid suffering.
Yeah. Or just like, or just has no empathy, or any element of it. It's like you can sit there and you can say those things, but the foundational thing that makes it true is that you know and understand suffering. If you can't get there, you can't start.
Well, I want to go another direction with these two scopes of time, because they also make me think of the time between our two conversations, and not just as some mysterious gap between then and now, but because your unfolding narrative as a writer, your unfolding quest narrative as a writer working on her sophomore novel, was a quest that was periodically visible to me as we would see each other in pre-pandemic days, periodically writing in the same cafe. I was getting updates from you. At one point, you had lost the editor who was working with you. She moved to a new house, and you were giving this new editor a chance. But you reached a place where you realized you had two entirely different visions for the novel and two very different ideas of the 19th century novel that you were trying to write. And you walked away from this relationship without knowing if this would ever become a book.
And owing lots of money.
Yeah. And this was years into the process. And I'd see you at the cafe and you'd tell me you'd rather fail on your own terms than succeed on the wrong terms, or I'm making that up, but something to that extent. And obviously you couldn't have known at the time that that you would end up succeeding so well without compromising your vision. But you talk about this dark decade in your acknowledgments, both saying that novels are like doomed marriages. And you talk about also the help you got and the years where you didn't do your fair share of dishes or your fair share of bills, and the people who did more than their fair share to try to make this novel succeed when it looked like it was going to fail. And the people were so invested in with their own sweat equity that when you finally decided to quit, you're told by your partner that it was no longer your decision, that essentially you were beholden to the people who'd been lifting you up for so long to bring this to an aesthetic resolution. And I guess I wondered if there's anything else you wanted to say, knowing that a lot of people listening are writers or artists or aspiring writers and artists, about that time when, you lost your editor who understood the book. You went through a considerable period of giving this other situation a chance, and then walked away from, worked your way out of a contract, walked away from money and from a publication deal. Is there anything about that you would like to add? I know you nodded to it earlier, but people always love when the curtain is pulled back on these sorts of things, the taboo around speaking about the business side of writing also. So if you do have anything about your quest narrative.
Well, it goes back to story too, right? And this is what I mean about story. And then I want to say something about the sort of business side of it. It is true that I said and felt and had made the decision for real that I would rather do it on my terms, in terms of what I was trying to go after, than succeed on. I would rather fail on mine than succeed on somebody else's. I don't know that I said it exactly like that, but that sounds like me. Yes, it was something very much along those lines. And I said that and I meant it. And when I tell that story, and you tell that story now, it is a story that ends in success. It is a story that ends with, like, I got to go to Knopf, and then I met, and like, and this happened and that happened. And I got longlisted for the national book, and it could just as easily be the other story. And that's the thing that's also true. So I do feel I was at that point with this book, and I did not have this idea that it was going to be rescue. You have to, okay, let me try to say this a little more eloquently. I guess what I'm saying is it's almost impossible for a writer who's struggling in the business side and also with where they want to be right now to not hear that and want to hear the story that it all ends well. Because of course, and yet while that is true in this case, it was equally possible that it be not true. In fact, it was more possible that it would be not true. And so I want to focus on the reason I said the thing I said, which was not bravado. I meant it, and I put my actions behind it. But I meant it. It wasn't, is that I was in music for years, and I made records that I did not love at different times. Some were okay, some were terrible, some were, I didn't do exactly what I wanted to do enough. I didn't stand my ground on certain things, and as a result, like, I spent 15 years doing something, and I don't actually have the proof of what I really did best anywhere to show my child or my family or anybody. You know what I mean? Like, there's things I'm like, oh, I'm pretty proud of that, but like nothing touched on what I actually really had the gift to do and how I did it. And so I don't have that to show. But I did learn all about the business and how to do all the things I needed to do. When I came into writing, I had that experience, and it was really, really clear to me that the only thing that matters is the work. Like, I only want that, the how do you make a living is the how do you make a living. So few people who are writing. There's a great story Johnny Evison told me when I first started writing, and I met him when Zazen came out. And he said, I was a baseball player. He was a pretty serious baseball player as a teenager. And he's like, I was a baseball player, and I was like looking at me a pro ball player, and I remember making that choice when it's like, yeah, not that many people get to go pro in baseball. I'm going to become a novelist instead. Like, and he said, he said, and then they did that piece, I don't know, 10 years ago, New York Times, something, found out there's only 200 novelists in the country who are making their money just off novels, right? And then Johnny, yells like, there were 1,300 baseball players, right? Like, this kind of idea. And I love that because, the question of how we make our living, some people, it's important for them that the ways they make their living say writer and hold that status. But most people are not making their money off novels. And so, I don't know, you make your own calls about what you need out of it. But I would rather have something that I have printed out in my basement and stapled together that I truly believe in to leave for my daughter than anything that, and the most beautiful thing about this, and I give this credit not to me, this is to the people I got to work with. When I finished this book and I got it back, there was not one compromise. I did not feel like there was one compromise. I didn't feel like there was one single thing I said like, yeah, okay. I mean, we had discussions, we had different feelings, but there was nothing that I had to eat it on, nothing. And that felt great. And I could have had that, like they made it better than I could have made it in my basement. Like, it's not, I mean, it was part of a process, but
it's not like you weren't taking feedback.
No,
it's not like I didn't compromise, meaning I wasn't going to listen to them. It was
no, I know. It wasn't like take it or leave it. We had conversations about everything. I mean, that's all I ever want for people. It's like, have a fair fight, like best idea wins. But the business side of it is also real. And I guess I do have opinions about that, particularly for women. Again, there's a gatekeeper mentality that really runs through that world, that there's beautiful, wonderful people in the literary world who are very moved by, they're in it for the right reasons, that care about books. There's tons of them. I met great people. There's also this, it's a very status driven world. And it's a world that's like, the status is very academic and performative, and it runs off a lot of cues that if you don't come from that world, you don't recognize it. And I think they'd lose a lot of good writers because of that.
I'm sure they do.
And, I even noticed coming from music that the very basic ways where I would say like, yeah, I'm not sure I really like, that I would defend or uphold my position on something, that to raise my voice at all was, all of a sudden, well, you think a lot of you know what I mean? Like, it was like, there was this incredible performative submission they expect writers to have. So different from music. Whereas like, it's just not this. It was like, people just go to Matt and was like, what the hell is my song? You know what I mean? Like you would have these bars, so different. There's a timidity that's built into the industry, and it's eroding, and things are changing, and it's shifting because it has to, because they don't hold the power that they really used to. Like, they can't really be gatekeepers to everything, in the same way with self-publishing and smaller presses and, all of that in online. But I do think, just because someone gives it to you doesn't mean it's a gift. Like, someone gives you an opinion, like, you be fully belligerent defense of your own artistic instinct. That's what you've got. It will trust that it will grow you, and find the people who are excited by that.
Well, I mean, I was thinking about that moment in the cafe with you when you're like telling me you're going to go for broke with the novel you wanted to write, perhaps literally broke, leaving the publishing house and the contract in hand without a place to land, essentially. So you're not leaping from, you didn't produce a place to land before you leapt.
It took me a year and a half. I owed $76,000.
it feels connected to a lot of the things that you write about growing up and hitchhiking tens of thousands of miles as a 15-year-old, and you're not knowing how you're going to make it one week to the next. One week it could be selling flowers by the highway. It could be doing farm labor. It could be digging ditches. It could mean sleeping under an underpass or not sleeping at all so that you knew when to jump out of a ride because the driver was about to assault you. And it feels very connected to something about your characters too, that that energy or that willingness to go forth without knowing how it's going to end up. And I guess I wanted to talk to you about something else in the book that feels connected both to your autobiography and this strange origin story of double mothers for your sister protagonists. And that is your dad's adoption. And you talked about this. You talked about one of the pieces you've written about it, that under somewhat mysterious circumstances, he gets adopted as a member of the Tlingit tribe in Alaska. And even though he didn't really on his own explore what that might have opened up for him, and so it wasn't really a big part of his life, ultimately, it doesn't sound like from what you've read.
It's changed some, and in some ways I have more information about that now than I did, but finish your question and I'll.
Okay. But nevertheless, when you were a toddler, some of your first memories were of being on Tlingit land with your adopted family and with all of that iconography and culture. So it is something you don't entirely belong to, but it's also something that you continually return to at the same time. And it's become a part of the narrative of this book with a ship named the Neva, which is the name of a Russian ship that fought in the Battle of Sitka, which you've referred to, which is the battle between the Russians and the Tlingit. So I was hoping you could talk about the Tlingit tribe and then the Tlingit in your life and the Tlingit in the book.
The Tlingit are an Athabascan indigenous people in Southeast Alaska and, not just in Southeast, but primarily, Tlingit and Haida are Southeast Alaskan. They have stories that match, geological and anthropological records that go back 10,000 years on the land. Some of the oldest sets of consistent storytelling and tribal consistency all the way back. They're remarkable. I am no expert. There are a lot of. My father was adopted in the early 70s when we moved up there. My father worked a lot with Tlingit activists and developed very, very deep relationships with them that continue to this day. One of the mentors and men in that world was a man named David Katzuk, and he died about 3 weeks ago. And David Katzuk was, I'm actually, so I was supposed to, when I was doing my sort of Zoom tour of the internet, I was also doing blog posts about the road trips that we sort of redid on the tour that that take place in the novel. And the last one is the stuff that involves Alaska and then goes out and I also did stuff with Tall Ship America and a variety of things. And I was supposed to post it about 3 weeks ago. It was right when David died. And he was an elder, a Tlingit elder. He was actually not from the clan that my father was adopted into, which was Kiksadi. So I am, Kiksadi ID. It's a maternal, the line comes maternally, and my mother was not adopted. So I'm recognized by my father's clan as a clan child. I'm not directly adopted because it would have had to been Kiksadi's a Raven moiety, and she wasn't adopted because they were in the middle of divorcing in that time. So the David Katzuk, so one of the things I'm doing in the next few days is I'm going to, which will be up by the time this comes out for sure. I'm trying to go back and put up the things I was going to say and say more about my relationship, even tangentially to the Tlingit, and talk about David Katzuk, who was a man that was a mentor to my father in many ways, who is of his generation and is left an enormous hole in the Tlingit culture up in Juneau recently. In Tlingit culture, you would say, he walked into the forest. That's how you talk about this. How he walked into the forest or walked in the woods. So it was David Kotzik who, I had the Fort of Young Saplings is a very complex story, and it would take a long time to sort of retell all of that here, and you don't need it. But I'd always had this relationship because, we talk about stories, and I was told at a very young age, this is, you have a Tlingit family, these are your Tlingit family, treat it like a real thing. And then I was also moved across the country. My parents were split up. I grew up with this idea in the back of my mind that I was from this, that I had a Tlingit family. And I was in a world in New York where they're like, all the Indians are dead. We killed all the Indians. I'm like, that's not true. I come from a family that was never beaten by anybody, because that's part of what I was raised to think. And so the intention to raise, but then I'm taken out of that context. I'm in another place and it begins to just sound like madness. And and then as you get older and you think about things, it feels like, okay, is this appropriation? Is it this? Is it that? And then I had periods where when I'd go back to Alaska, I was reconnected, and it was real in the way that it was real and not real in the way that it was not real. But what my feeling was to continue to just show respect for it and learn. So
can I connect? I know you don't want to go into the Battle of Sitka.
I'm willing to go where you want. It's fine.
But I did want to connect it to this question from the very beginning around invisibility in narratives, the absence of narratives and what effect that has. Because one of the fascinating things in one of your writings about it is that they consider one of their central stories their victory over the Russians.
Oh, yeah.
and yet when you go to, say, the Wikipedia page or most sort of American or European accounts of that battle, they were roundly defeated in those narratives by the Russians.
And that's not
so we have these two, like the official account is that they were defeated, and their account is the opposite.
They won. Yeah.
They won. So that's fascinating.
Yes.
And around this invisibility of narrative. So obviously that's their victory did not, as you suggested around, say, a female quest narrative, didn't become iconic and enter the larger culture,
right?
And literally enter like whatever the shared history of various peoples. So what's that all about? In a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the Fort of Young Saplings, I write about. There was this book that had been. This also gets to story. I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly because I haven't heard it pronounced in so long. I know, and I'm nervous I'll get it. It's like which is the sort of story ownership concept in Tlingit culture. And it is very unique and different from other kinds of cultures. And it's got very specific rules around it. And so, for instance, there are stories that I can share, that I can technically share, that I probably reality wouldn't share because I still feel tentative about all of this, but that I theoretically could share because I have this Kiksadi, lineage that allows me to tell Kiksadi stories. I don't have, many other, clan lines that would allow me to tell other stories. So you don't just get to tell somebody else's story. Well, this created a problem in the sense that, fundamentally when the Tlingits kicked the Russians out of Sitka twice, and they beat them twice, that involved technically a move where they gave up the fort and then retook the surrounding areas. Giving up the fort to a European, and I did a lot of research on this, that's in the story, giving up the fort to a European military eye, everything about accepting defeat is built into the ritual of taking that space and switching ownership of that space. But that was a European understanding. of what the rules, everything about the rules of war, like what engage prisoners, like is all about taking that spot.
Okay, but let me, I want to spend some time with something that's still blowing my mind.
Okay.
And which is your whole investigation, which brings us back to big novels, right? So your theory, you're wondering, and your theory that you explore, and you go to great lengths to explore this. Was it possible that the strategies that the Tlingit used to defeat the Russians may have influenced or informed the Russians' own strategy shortly after against Napoleon, where they do the unheard of thing, according to military strategy? They abandon Moscow, their seat of power, in advance of the arrival of Napoleon's troops, an event that is immortalized by Tolstoy in War and Peace. So here we are back at the 19th century, Russia. So if this is true, this would connect everything. Your adopted family, your love of 19th century novels, and your novel. And I just love this investigation. It is so cool. And I want you to talk a little bit about it, if you will.
Yeah, I got obsessed with this. And it came up as I read about the Battle of Sitka. And I really started to break it down. Okay, but I do have to go back and say the reason there was no writing about the Battle of Sitka from a Tlingit perspective was because of two things. Basically, the Tlingit perspective that if it's not your story to tell, you don't tell it. Like, you don't just publicly share stories. That's story ownership is a big thing. The other thing is if you've had a war and you've moved to a peace, you don't bring up those old stories. It's considered a way to start a war again, or be rude. Like, you bury those stories with you. So there wasn't anybody speaking on the Tlingit side about what actually happened and what, in this way, until over a period of 30 years, Richard and Nora Dunhauer collected, Nora was Tlingit and her partner was an linguist anthropologist. And they collected all this work and they got all the permissions and they got the stories and they set it up in a Tlingit way. And they were able to finally make something that put them together. And I was reading that. The idea that War and Peace, which is a huge, it's one of my favorite novels ever. I read it a bunch of times. I just automatically, when I was reading the Battle of Sitka, I'm like, this is like the battle for Moscow that Kutuzov has. I mean, it was instantly to me, how strange is this? That, how is this any different? I began to look at the dates and then I began to come up with this crazy idea. Like, is it possible? Is it possible? Well, what's the first impossibility? And what I ran into when I first started to try to tap the web with historians about it, like, I have this crazy idea. I'm wondering, and I would pose it and oh my gosh, the disgust with which I was responded to about like how ridiculous an idea that was incredible. Like, multiple people were just like, the guy who wrote a book I actually used as one of the resources, and it was so offended by it, he stopped talking. It was crazy. And, and I was like, I'm just asking a question. And like, that's where you go like, wow, how can it be so insane to ask such a simple question, right? How could the great Kutuzov, famous for saving Russia, have had an idea that came from the indigenous people of South, how could it, So I was, first of all, trying to track it down in a couple of different ways. One, I wanted to find a European, I remember being on the phone with people going like, I need to find a really good historian who specializes in European warfare of, the 18th, 19th century. And it was a really lovely man who's a very illustrious historian who just put me in touch with this unbelievably wonderful English gentleman whose specialty was land battles in the 19th century, and he taught in England at their office, sort of their West Point. He taught military tactics and history at West Point. And I met him on Armistice Day. And we were sitting there with poppies and like in this, and I think we talked for about 6, maybe it's like 4 hours in this pub. And he was so gentle, and he listened to my whole theory, like my whole, like, okay, so this, and he asked all these like lovely questions about, could I draw this? Could I draw what I was talking about here? Could I say, and then he just stopped and he stepped back and he said, let me tell you about rules of engagement in the medieval system. And then he began to just talk me through. But he had this, he was just such a lovely, lovely man to deal with on this. And I still stay in contact with him. He sends me his new history book. Like, it's great. But this idea was, could it have happened? And what I needed to find was a tie, some kind of tie that shown how that story in its more specific forms could have gone through back to a link to Kutuzov. And I got this, I got a researcher who was like a kid from Reed who spoke Russian and was broke and sketchy, and had him look up a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, like, it was done. And trying to find all these different, and it's been years since I've looked at the research I did on that, but I found all these things where they almost connected, where like you almost could put him in the room with the person you could put him in the room with, but you couldn't quite do it until I saw the Tolstoy connection.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't feel like you proved it, but you certainly seemed to establish multiple ways it could have happened.
Yes, it could.
I mean, one of them being Tolstoy's older cousin,
yes,
who he would listen to telling stories.
Mm-hmm.
Tolstoy would listen to his older cousin coming back from these huge sailing trips.
He was on the Nadezhda, which was the other boat that went with the Neva.
Yeah, so the Neva was the one in the Battle of Sitka, and the other principal boat for Russia was the one that Tolstoy's older brother was on. But I think he also established some shared neighborhoods in Moscow of certain people who could have come home and spoken to each other.
Yeah. When I go down a wormhole, I go down a wormhole. Like,
I want you to be right.
I want to be right. I think
I do. I want you to be right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so great.
And I do believe that they, with not in the state of metaphor, but, and I think my piece there makes a strong case that the Tlingit won the Battle of Sitka.
Yeah. Which we learn a little bit about in the Great Offshore Grounds.
A little bit. I do want to, so David Kotzik, the man I mentioned before, when I was writing Great Offshore Grounds, and when I was writing this, I went up to Juneau for a 40-day, which is part of there's certain rituals after death and before the full Kuich party. And so the 40-day is a 40 days after, but it's kind of a quick one compared to the kind of potlatch and party Kuich you would do afterwards. And I went up and I met with him, and he told me a whole bunch of stories that I could only hear because of my Kiksati, he had a Kiksati forebear somewhere in his family. So he was a story bear, he had a lot of old stories. And so he passed them on and told a lot of them to me. And there are very tiny parts that no one would ever notice in the Tlingit sections of this book that are nods to him, that are nods to the stories without telling those stories, but that like just have an object like an orange or something in it.
I love that.
Yeah. And so I've been thinking about him in it a lot, and like, so the only places I publicly used stories that I heard were places where they were already published in the Russians in Tlingit America.
Okay. Well, I wanted to end with the title and a couple of things about the title. I love the title because of the tension between offshore and grounds. Something both watery and fluid and out of reach, and something solid and stable and right under our feet, held together like that or juxtaposed. But it's also a real place, and one connected to the other boat we've talked about, the Essex, because at that point we had eliminated so many whales to such a degree that the Essex had to go thousands of miles off the coast to the offshore grounds to even find the whales to kill them. And it is there that the ship is sunk by one great whale. And it feels like that that feels like poetry. And it also feels that, and the consumption of the dead, and then the drawing of lots to eat who's going to be eaten and who's going to eat. Just feels like a fitting allegory for late stage capitalism. Not that you spell any of that out about the Essex at all in the book. But I was thinking about how you've said that you don't know for sure why your dad was adopted, and how you had always thought that it was political, but you've come more recently to think that it could have been due to love, a love that couldn't be out in the open. And so that the adoption was something to facilitate that love possibly happening. And that definitely feels like a motif in the book. People joining the army, or hiding their illness, or joining a political movement, to head to both a metaphorical offshore grounds or a literal offshore grounds, not out of greed or curiosity or conquest, but out of love. I don't know. Did you see that in the book, that vein of, I don't think it's optimism for the future, but maybe the sort of a very present thread of care and love? That there's a way in which I feel like you take this willingness to go to the edge, into the like thousands of miles offshore. Let's take it as a metaphor in this case, for someone else, as a way to sort of flip that narrative. I mean, the people aren't out there eating necessarily in the book. I mean, none of this happens in the book, but like, I'm thinking of how, like, in real life, people are going out there because we have no like sustainable reciprocal relationship to the land and to the ocean. And so we have to keep going farther out on the edge. And then so much so that we're eating each other alive, essentially. But there's a way in which you flip it, I think.
It is exactly that those questions that I had, that you were talking about around the adoption, were very conscious in mind, particularly because as I began to think about that, I began to think about how much of politics is done, how many choices are done because of the person you're doing them for or with. And that I think we tell ourselves a lot of lies about that. And, it goes from the simplest side to like, oh, I had a girlfriend who was a socialist, but now I have a girlfriend who's not, and so everything's different. You know what I mean? Like, there's that shallow version of that. But then there's also, when it comes to those final moments of, I'm going to give up something for real because I believe in you and you believe in it, or because not necessarily for those things. And it's kind of a cliche about army that, like, you don't die for the country, you die for the person beside you. Like, there's a lot of that. I think that's just deep into a lot of things. And I think in leftist and progressive worlds, we pretend that that's not there at all, as well. And I think that, so there was very much in my mind with the stories of Livia and Sarah, it was very much in my mind, where I think, I won't do it for that, but I will do it for this. This book has a lot more love in it. Not because of love stories, but because, so the friend of mine who I mentioned before, who had read it a whole bunch of times, she had read Zazen too, and said she really liked Zazen, but she said this, when I list everything that happens in this book, it just sounds like the darkest thing ever. Like, it's like darker than, like, in some ways it's like way darker, like all the things that happen. He said, but it feels so different.
It does. And it feels like a book of care.
Yeah. Like
enacted over and over and over again.
Yeah. And I went through a real process in writing it. It sounds strange, but like this was a very profound experience for me. To try to write this book was very, very hard. And one of the things I came up to again and again and again was like, how much darkness, how much love, how much dark, like, it felt like Yeah. I mean, I had crazy dreams. I had like this, the whole, I would sound like a mad woman if I told you the story of the internal experience of writing this thing. And it's of no interest to anybody, so I'll spare everybody. But like there was just this quality of, you know, going as deep as you could into these experiences. And it's because the characters love each other. They love each other and I love them and I'm writing it, right? Like, you know,
Yeah.
and so that just, it changed. It showed me how much that alone could change everything in a story. You know, and I didn't know that. You know, like I feel like I learned about love and what it could do. And I didn't know it in the same way. And that is because I was also experiencing it with my daughter, with my partner, with other, you know what I mean? Like as I was deepening to understanding some of these things and in a lot of despair, you know, it was just, it was all part of a piece, but it was also a blindness. It was writing in blindness for 8 years. It felt like it was the most shamanic writing experience I've ever had. Like it just was, you know, people say, how did that feel? Like terrible, terrible. I never want to feel like that again, ever. Like there was nothing, there was 8 years of misery, you know, to try to get at it, you know?
Yeah. Well, so I'm hesitant to ask you this question because of that. This long road trip, that you went on, this 8 years of miserable writing experience. Because I think you should be, I want to ask you what you're working on next, but I don't want to ask you that because I sort of feel like you should be in a hammock somewhere now.
Well,
You should have given this interview from a hammock.
no.
And, but what are you working on next? Or if you're not working on something, what does writing this, what does it compel you to want to write?
So when this went into the publishing cycle, I went back to work as a union organizer, which I had not done for 16 years because of the state we find ourselves in and because I worked for healthcare workers unions. And I began working for a nursing home workers union and home care workers union, and you know, and then COVID hit and all of this kind of stuff. And there's just, you know, a lot of work and fighting and organizing and things to do. And so I kind of went back into that world 100%. In that world, I am not writing. In that world, I'm working all the time and I'm not writing. And I know that that's the nature of that world. And that was okay and is okay because I made a conscious choice that for this time, in these moments, in this place, that's what I want to be doing. But also because I knew as a writer that I often need a year or two after finishing a project to just like remember why I ever wanted to write again. Part of the drawback of being somebody who sort of thinks encyclopedically or maximally about things is I tend to throw everything in and then I got nothing. You know what I mean? Like once I'm done, then I'm done for a while. Like I've got to like, you know, I've got to let the fields go, you know? So I had a very encouraging thought about a week ago about a project that that I've always intended to go back to, and it's a novella I want to pair with short stories, and it's half finished, and there were things I liked and didn't like about it, and all of a sudden I had this kind of like, oh, I know exactly what that thing is about, and I didn't know it when I started it, and I had this like, just take for a second that I couldn't describe that I knew what I was trying to write about and how to go do it. And there was just this quick moment of going like, yeah. And then I was like, and in a year, I'm going to get to it. So, you know, I think I'm in a place of just letting the world hit me again. And know what I know as an artist that I didn't know as a younger artist is that it just grows back and it grows back and it grows back. And even when I'm not writing, my artistic mind is developing and growing. And whenever I start again, I will be somewhere new. And the work is not getting It's different to stop in the middle of a project than to stop between. They have very different outcomes.
Right.
And so I don't have any fear about stuff. I mean, that's where you have to separate the business. It's not good for your career. It wasn't good for my career to take 8 years to write a book. You know, I mean, like, these things are not good for your career, but the work is the work.
Yeah. You just need to, so speaking about gendered responses in the business world, you just need to figure out how to be the female version of Jeffrey Eugenides or Jonathan Franzen, who put out one book every 10 years. Right. And it's an event.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I don't know that they're going to, I don't think the world is opening up to me in that particular moment.
I hope it is.
My mom would sit there and go like, all these last 8 years, my mom would say like, you don't want to be Donna Tartt. You don't want to. I'm like, what do you mean? She's doing fine. She was just like, she had that first book and everybody was excited. And it took 9 years to get her next book. You know, it was just like, and then of course it did great to it. It was just like, what do you mean you don't want to be Donna Tartt? Like, of course you, like, that's my mom. Like, she wants to tell you.
Well, thank you for being on Between the Covers again, Vanessa.
Thanks, David.
We're talking today to Vanessa Veselka about her latest book from Knopf, The Great Offshore Grounds. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was not recorded at the studios of KBOO, but at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength, makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. You can find more of Vanessa Veselka's work at vanessaveselka.com. Also, don't forget that listeners of today's program can get 20% off on Ix de Maya Murray's new novel or any other book put out by Northwestern University Press with the code POD20 at their website, nupress.northwestern.edu. If you enjoyed today's program, consider supporting Between the Covers. Head over to patreon.com/betweenthecovers, where you can learn about the bonus audio archive, collectible items, or writing advice by your favorite writers, getting a bundle of books sent to you and curated by me, or joining Tin House's early readership subscription. Again, this and much more can be found at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo, Elisa Ogie, and Spencer Ruchti in the book division, Jacob Valla in the art department, Vishwena Cantor in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the summer and winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating the outro. Their album Imre Lodbrog, A Sapatita Me, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.